Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with the support of the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These funds will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our website at the link shown below. Then click on the donate button at the top of the page. We also continue to post this talk and all past and future presentations in the lecture series on our website. Today, we are happy to welcome Robert Nott, a longtime reporter for our own Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper, and Gabriela Campos, a photographer for the New Mexican. Robert and Gabriela traveled a significant part of the Santa Fe Trail last year, reporting on and photographing events and activities surrounding the trail's bicentennial celebration. It was in 1821 that the trail was opened by William Becknell as the major trading route between the United States and Mexico. Robert will talk about his own travels and share his observations during this trip, many of which were captured in a series of articles published by the New Mexican last fall. Gabriela's photos provide a rich visual record of their trip. Let us now welcome our presenters, Robert Nott and Gabriela Campos.
Hey, Friends of History, thanks for having us. In case you're wondering, I'm Robert Nott.
And I'm Gabriela. Thank you so much for having us.
I should warn you that the third member of our traveling tour across the trail 1 year ago is Gizmo, the Wonder Dog. He's behind us. He may pop up and give you a surprise cameo. He was a wonderful traveling companion as Gabriela and I recreated some of the trail last year, which was the 200th anniversary of the founding of the trail back in the autumn of 1821, a history that I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with. And it is the Santa Fe New Mexican's news editor, Phil Casaus, who came up with the idea of sending us on a good portion of the old Santa Fe Trail to sort of recreate what it was like for those travelers coming across 200 years ago. And we both sort of eagerly jumped into it. Gabby and I have known each other and worked with each other for years, and we have a really good rapport. And thankfully, she likes Gizmo and Gizmo likes her. So that's how the idea came about. We were encouraged by a lot of people, including members of the old Santa Fe Trail Association, I think the Friends of History, and other local groups that wanted a little commemoration of what the trail meant, its history. And as I rethink about our travels a year ago in my 2015 Jeep Wrangler, which was probably much more comfortable than some of the wagons that he took a couple hundred years ago, I'm sort of amazed and amused and embarrassed to tell you that we improvised most of it. We ad-libbed most of it. We really didn't have much of a sense of where we were going or who we would meet along the trail. And that can be very nerve-wracking for journalists who are supposed to come back with a story. But now a year later, I can say that was sort of like how it was for the people on the trail. I mean, would you agree, Gabriela?
Yeah, and that's kind of part of the fun, to see who you're going to meet along the trail. And we met a lot of really important and promising characters that taught us a lot that we weren't quite expecting to meet. So that's always part of the fun of being on the road, being on assignment together.
It really was. So there was that sense of a new frontier, but we had it a lot easier than they did. I mean, we got to stay in a hotel at night. We could go out for dinner. The paper would reimburse us for dinner, which was even better. Although I had to put my beer on a separate tab so they didn't know I was drinking at night after, of course, I finished my long day's journey. And we had my 2015 Jeep Wrangler. But we got a sense of what it was like to ride over the wagon routes. The wagon wheels were still etched in some parts of the lands, particularly in northern New Mexico. And we knew we were traveling over frankly, the land of the dead, those that had come across and maybe not made it all the way, who died out by Autograph Rock, which was our first stop. That was about 40 miles east of Clayton in New Mexico. And it was a huge sandstone rock formation, which had a little, I'll call it a little valley area where the wagons could come in and rest by a creek. And on that rock are etched, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of names to be honest and fair and factual, not just of Santa Fe Trail travelers. There were some modern day, and by modern day, I mean going back to the 1980s, teenagers or whatnots who went and etched names there. But we could figure out, with the help of the Sharps, which is the couple that pretty much oversees Autograph Rock on their property, we could figure out which ones dated back to the 1820s, 30s, 40s. And Gabriela took some great photos of those. What was that like for you to take photos of those autographs? Because I remember we had to split up. It's a funny thing about a photographer and a reporter. You work together, but you really, and Gabriela would often talk with me about this, you really have different jobs to do. So she would at one point just go off on her own to find the best autograph and how she could get a shot of it. So what's your memory of that?
What I was really impressed by was the writing in which the names were written. Some of them were written in the most precise, beautiful penmanship that I've come across in my life, better than people's handwriting. And to think that it was chiseled into the stone bluffs by hand, and the time that it took, and the person taking the time to sit there for hours and hours to get it just perfect. And another thing that I was really impressed by was the repeat names that we saw made the journey numerous times. They came back and forth, and we're always noting their presence. Some names kept reoccurring, as you remember.
That's right. You're reminding me. That is correct. They would come back time and again, and once again etch their name with a year below it. And it was interesting because we were doing this at the height of the pandemic. And while we took safety precautions and we were comfortable with each other, we were reminded that there were times on the trail where this little valley by Autograph Rock, which was Dakota, I just remembered it was Dakota sandstone, this was a haven for when they had cholera. They would pull in there and try to stay enclosed and away from everyone. And we're pretty certain, as are the Sharps, who again run the property, that a lot of people didn't make it out of that valley, that many died there and were buried there. And their names may well be up there on that rock. We can't correlate the names to the potential graves below, but it was sort of a great first place to stop, because also imagine their excitement now. They're in what we call Oklahoma now. They know they're 20, 25 miles away from what was then the territory of New Mexico. They know they're getting closer to the end of the trail, even though most of them, having not traveled it before, really had no idea what they were coming into when they hit Santa Fe, in the autumn, in the summer, maybe in the early winter of 21, 22, 31, 32, whichever part of the roughly 50-year period the Santa Fe Trail existed as a route. Sort of got me thinking that it was the first interstate highway, the first truck route really for trade. And that played in our head as we stopped at these places and met these people who taught us things about the trail we did not know, that we could later confirm when we went back and got our mitts on a computer. And Autograph Trail was like the first place to go. There were the names. Who were the people behind the names?
It was also a good reminder that Autograph Rock was so important because it was a point where there was water. And that was something that was so important to the early travelers, was to follow routes where there would be water. And there was a small creek nearby, right?
Yes.
And that was one of the most important reasons why they stopped there to begin with. And just the details we picked up along the way, I remember we learned from the Sharps that cholera was a really big problem for the travelers at that point. So they would stop to drink some whiskey infused with chili as a remedy. And it was just those details, like the little bottles that were found and the little things that they found, the little mementos from the past. It's always the details for me that kind of paint a picture. And those are the things I kind of like so much.
And Gabby has a really good eye for that, which she should. She's a photographer. I'm not, but she has a really good way of articulating that. Oh, there goes Gizmo. Sorry. He's leaving. He's going out back on the trail. She has a really wonderful way of remembering those details in what she saw, whereas I had time later to write about them. And I thought about it, and I asked Gabby this, I'm going to ask her right now. I thought about the fact that those travelers, we know they kept diaries. We know some of the women told their stories. And yet, of course, they did not have in the 1820s, 30s, maybe pushing towards the Civil War years, maybe a few of them had cameras, although cameras didn't really come into great public use into the end of the trail days. But I wondered, wow, she got to take photos in a way that they didn't. I wonder do you think they etched? Did they draw? What's your thoughts about what they saw and how they could capture them to stay forever in our memory?
I feel like we know that a couple of the travelers kept pretty detailed diaries and journals. So I would imagine the best account would be drawings at this point. But I just feel like it was very important to photograph these names on this rock because even with my modern camera, it was really hard to capture the detail of the signatures because they're fading so much. And I imagine in time they'll probably disappear completely because I know some of the older signatures were pretty hard to see. And those are probably the most important because those are the first travelers that made it across. So just as anything, I feel like we're historians in our own sense that we are kind of preserving the memory a little bit more. And like these photographs, again, like the names eventually will fade. And I just feel lucky to be part of preserving this trail a little bit through my photos.
And those autographs likely won't fade, which was another wonderful thing. Interesting too, Autograph Rock was one of roughly three, help me with this, Gabby, like high landmark, mountainous landmarks that they used. Autograph Rock. Rabbit Ears would be next up near Clayton.
And then Wagon Mound would be the one that would signify that they're closest to Santa Fe, maybe just a couple of days out at that point.
So it was fun to watch those, again in our modern day Jeep as we went down the highway. I wonder how many people are Santa Fe Trail historians, amateur or not, who stop at every one of these places, excited to find a moment, a place and time. And how many people just drive by without really knowing, why is that called Wagon Mound, or what's the significance of Wagon Mound or Autograph Rock? Another thing which we were graced with, because we're both easygoing people and we know how to meet people on the trail, we know how to be laid back and comfortable. It's just people who would take us, frankly, on private property that perhaps maybe you all can get on as friends of history people, but a lot of people cannot get there. So we kind of felt privileged, and we did not want to ever take that privilege for advantage when they took us way off trails, way up in the hills to places that are not really accessible to the public. That's not true of Wagon Mound, by the way, which you can drive down to anytime you like, 2 hours east of Santa Fe. You can even climb pretty close up to Wagon Mound now. But we stopped at a couple places that we knew we were honored to be at, that most people cannot get to. Which brings us sort of to our next stop, which up the road on the other side of the border into New Mexico, was the Clayton area, north of the Clayton area. And almost by pure chance, we went to the local museum. Oh my gosh, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the name of it, but please go to the museum in downtown Clayton. It's a great WPA collection. And there we met local historian, Charlie Jordan. The guy looks like an old-time cowboy who's seen a lot of living. The lines in his face were like the lines etched by the travelers along the old Santa Fe Trail. And Charlie just took a liking to us and almost immediately said, "Jump in my truck, we're going for a ride." He took us way up on property that I'm sure we could not have gotten to by Rabbit Ears, and we went to Turkey Creek, right?
It was Turkey Creek.
Turkey Creek.
Where it was an old campsite and a sort of stone corral where early travelers would keep their horses and probably stay for the night. He also got to take us to McNee's Crossing, a pretty important site along the trail. It was where the first Independence Day celebration was celebrated.
Was recorded in the early 1830s, 1831. So 10 years after the trail was quote unquote founded, now you've got your first recorded 4th of July ceremony. And McNee was one of two unfortunate travelers who apparently stopped in the springs there. And we went down to the springs and took some photos, probably to bathe, which would have been nice to do in the summer. And the two companions were killed by, we're not sure which Indian tribe. But unfortunately, this is a subtext, of course, of the trail that we know too well, the conflict between the Native Americans and the travelers. We want to be excited that the trail occurred, that Manifest Destiny was playing out, that America felt the right to claim any lands it could conquer during that time. And along the way, that meant, in some cases, peace treaties and good relationships. And unfortunately, and probably in way too many cases, conflict, death, disease when it came to the Native American tribes. The trail crossed at least a dozen certified tribal lands, at least one pueblo here in New Mexico. And so in the wake of the killing of McNee and his companion, when some Indians rode up upon a group of Santa Fe Trail travelers, those travelers assumed those were the same Native Americans that had killed the two men. They could have been, they could not have been, and they opened fire on them. And that was typical of the things we learned of guilt by association. We're missing some horses. A few Native Americans ride up on the camp, coincidentally, gee, you must have been the Native Americans who took our horses, let's kill you. And in that case, so it had a tragic end to it, but it also denoted, the 4th of July, celebrating America, celebrations on the trail. And I'm sure part of that was the 4th of July up, north of Clayton. They're going 10, 12, 13 miles a day. They're going to be in Santa Fe in a few days. They're excited. The end's coming and they're celebrating. Life is good. This is America. But also the trail was life is bad. You died along the way. And so did a lot of people who you met along the way. I was trying to remember some of the photos you took when we went up there with Charlie. Like, you stepped away. There was a monument that no one can get to about McNeese Crossing, which was built, I can't remember, Gabby, I'm going to say early 1900s. And you did go down by the springs. They're probably much different than they were, but you had a sense of the grasslands of the vast empire. You had a sense of, you could see rabbit ears named after a local Indian chief, even though it does not look anything like rabbit ears. But the two mountains that said you're getting closer. And I'm trying to remember some of the things you pulled over and wanted to take photos of.
I kind of wanted to capture the vastness of the space, the flatness of the prairie, the grasslands, because it felt like it could go on and on forever. And I kind of wanted to capture that with some of the photos and give a sense of what the travelers might have felt. Because for me, it felt like at certain points, like I believe some of the travelers experienced something called sky sickness, where it was just nothing but sky. There was just nothing on the horizon. That's why those points of interest were so important, Rabbit Ears and Wagon Man, because they were the only signals out in relatively flat land. So I just wanted to give a sense of how things could feel like they were going on and on and on forever, and how it kind of could feel pretty hopeless at certain points. And why, when you would see those monuments, it would provide so much hope for these travelers that they were finally getting to their destination. So I was always asking Robert, maybe rather abruptly, pull over, you gotta pull over. Because I just wanted to capture that openness.
Yeah, I would sometimes not be sympathetic to it as a reporter who wanted to get back and start researching. But yeah, it was all there. It was the vastness was there, the emptiness was there, the fear, the hope, the joy, the heat, the sun.
Even I felt like there were spots where there was not a tree in sight, and I could imagine how desperate you must feel just traveling under the hot summer New Mexican sun, just hoping to find a little bit of break from that, and there was nothing.
Gizmo's chasing a bear out back. If I have to get up and go chase it with my gun, I will. We got further and further west. There was this excitement of like, what was it like for them? Charlie, the guy we met up there north of Clayton, said, you can jump in your car and get to the other side of Rabbit Ears in a couple hours. But for these people, that was going to be another 5-6 days. Every morning waking up, there's Rabbit Ears, which then led us to keep on moving west and hoping we met people. And in Wagon Mound, we met Mr. Schmidt. I'm trying to remember what his first name was. He was fantastic. He was James Daniel Schmidt. He was in his early 90s. He lived in the shadow of Wagon Mound, a huge rock formation that you could argue looks like a wagon from one side.
Yes.
And he was a historian of the trail. And we visited with him in his backyard, right in the, with Wagon Mound there. And he was wondering, whether anyone would remember the significance of the trail at its 300th anniversary, whether kids were being taught the significance of the trail in history classes today in New Mexico schools, whether anyone cared, frankly, about the trail, which meant so much to him growing up in the shadow of Wagon Mound. Yet another beautiful destination where you could stop, where there was water. And yet, as we came down the railroad tracks towards the trail, there was also that reminder that railroad tracks, progress, technology, that would signal the end of the trail by the 1880s. I may have to go check on Gizmo. You keep talking. I have total faith in you.
And I have a photo of that moment exactly. It was a photograph with Wagon Mound in the back with the train tracks leading up to it. And it's kind of a photo that symbolizes that change, that everything kind of came to a close. I think 1880 when the railroad came into town. So that kind of signified that. And speaking with him in the town of Wagon Mound also kind of showed how that place too will kind of become a relic of the past. Once like a very vibrant little town, but the main street is kind of fall into the shadows too. And it kind of reminds me of the whole Santa Fe Trail as a whole, how like it's fading a little bit into the rearview mirror.
That I know exactly what you're talking about. Gizmo would have been typical, by the way, of some dogs they probably brought on the trail who would be like outlier scouts. So I appreciate that you're all tolerating his hijinks well. Yeah, there was that sense also of history fading, the people who came after the people on the trail fading, the little towns built up by the trail, and frankly devastated, not so much by the railroad, assuming the railroad stopped there, but Route 66 and ultimately I-25, you know. So there was a sadness to going through Wagon Man at the time. But I can't help but think, again, these travelers, these towns were so little. Clayton, in fact, wasn't even a town when the Santa Fe Trail started. It was a town in the last few years of it. So there was no pulling into Clayton and, you know, the old movie saloons where you could get a drink, and it just didn't exist for these people. And that kept coming back to us as we kept moving west. And Wagon Man was the third big structure for us to look at and say, whoa, here's a signpost of hope. Here's a signpost for getting closer to home. We also stopped in Las Vegas, and you photographed up beyond Las Vegas, where the original meeting between Becknell and some local militia, signaled, that Becknell had first arrived in the autumn of 21, I think close to November. I think he got to Santa Fe in November of 21. So we went up there and sort of photographed that valley. Gabriela did most of the work on that one. And that certainly would have meant, we're in the home stretch. Although one more time, 12, 13, 14 miles a day, they still had 3 or 4 days to Santa Fe. What's your recollection of that Las Vegas valley where we stopped? There was also a monument.
I guess it's just another reminder of that feeling of hope. And I believe like near Wagon Man, there is a valley called the Valley of Hope, just because
That's right.
It was such a close point to Santa Fe where people finally felt a little bit of relief. So it just, again, the closer you got to Santa Fe, you started feeling the relief of those travelers. Like we've made it. We've made this long journey. Some of them maybe didn't make it. As we know, not a lot of women were on the trail to begin with. So it was a huge relief to them. And that's another story that kind of Robert focused on, was the women that made the trail, which was only a handful that we could find recollections of and accounts for.
One of the as we got closer to Santa Fe, having improvised most of this 4-day trip, then we found George Bayless Donahoe, who was again in his early 90s. And he was the great grandson of Mary Dodson Donahoe, who now some people think might have been the first woman to actually cross the trail. The first Anglo woman to cross the trail, long before Susan. I want to say McDuffin. I'm getting the name wrong, but you know who I mean. And so we visited with him. He had some interesting things to say about his great grandmother, who he did not meet, but she opens one of the first hotels in Santa Fe, where the La Fonda is now. And it spoke to women coming across the trail, mothers coming across the trail, romance coming across the trail, business women as business women. They could have their own lives here. They could have a new life, getting away from back east, back from Missouri, where the trail started, maybe from Pennsylvania or New York, having made their way to Missouri. So we got that story in too. And we did take some wonderful photos of George up by the monument to the Santa Fe Trail here in Santa Fe, where some people say you can still see wagon tracks up in that area. And they would have come in over that hill, with Santa Fe just below them. And frankly, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, probably through the Civil War, seen a lot of what we would call mud adobe huts, and nothing particularly romantic or exciting, but a lot of them made their life here. And Miss Donahoe was one of them. And her great-great-grandson, again, drew us back into that history. He was a connection to the past, as was Charlie Jordan, as was Mr. Schmidt. We sort of met these people along the way. It was like God, maybe the God of the old Santa Fe Trail, if I can say that, was giving us this gift of these people who connected us to the history and who very much want to keep the history alive. Do you remember much about him when we went up and met him and photographed him up there?
I just remember how impressed he was with his great-great-grandmother. Not only did she make the journey, but she made the journey with a 9-month-old child, her child. And I can't imagine how hard that must have been, traveling with an infant at that point. And that she must have just been such a resilient woman to have made it, because she was out there on her own. She was out there probably how many weeks on the trail?
Well, the trail would take, it was an 800 or 900 mile trail, depending on which way you went. Mind you, when we went through Oklahoma, we were taking what we call the shorter trail. If you went up through Colorado and down through Raton Pass, I believe there were more odds of water. There was more chance of water. That was in many ways safer, but it was also another 100 miles. But they spent, weeks on the trail, if not longer. I think everyone knows that. And you did remind me, she came across with a baby girl. She may have had a Hispanic servant. I'm not sure. But in doing this series, we got to see all the elements of water, land, hope, landmarks. We got to see manifest destiny playing itself out for better and for worse. We know along this trail there was a chance of a new life. And there was an equal chance of death, that you would die on the trail or perhaps come out here and not want to stay long. And in fact, Ms. Donahoe did not stay long. When there began to be insurrections in New Mexico, she and her husband headed back east, but she was a main player in the history of the Santa Fe Trail. And I'm also aware here that there's a lot of names, despite Autograph Rock, and a lot of people whose names and histories we'll never know across that trail. Besides that, I did a couple pieces talking to historians by phone about the Native American relationships, the Hispanic relationships. Covered a recreation of the trail into Santa Fe. And it was just in general, probably one of the most rewarding jobs I've had in roughly 25 years as a journalist for the Santa Fe New Mexican. In retrospect, I wish we could have taken it farther, maybe going all the way back to Missouri and played it out like that. What could we have met? Who could we have seen? And it was just like we were given this gift of people, of time, of history, just a sense of what it was like. And quite frankly and selfishly, I'm glad I didn't have to go through it. Not back in 21, 31, 41, 1881.
I think it would have been a huge advantage if we could have started in Missouri, just to see how the travelers began their trip and how they ended it, and how the landscape can change so wildly within that space. So I feel like maybe in a couple of years, maybe Robert and I could do the story one more time, start at the beginning of the trail, to really give a sense of the entire journey, the monuments that we missed, because I'm sure there are monuments before that would have been very significant. Follow the waterways, try to see if there's anything that remains, talk to the characters, because there is a sense of pride along the trail, especially around where we began. We started at a museum too in Oklahoma.
That's right.
And they had such a collection of artifacts and stories, and if we could have even taken that a little step further, I just can't imagine what we would have learned, because we met so many people, and there was still so much pride in that trail and the people that walked it. And it has made a huge effect in New Mexico. I was looking over Robert's stories just yesterday, and he was talking about a gentleman named Franz Huning, who made the trail numerous times. And it kind of struck me that, so interesting that now I live in Albuquerque, but I live in the Huning Highlands, and it was this neighborhood that he developed, and he was a huge component on the trail. So, and just driving over to Robert's house today, I drove on Old Santa Fe Trail, and just so many reminders of the importance of these people that made it numerous times. I didn't realize Franz was on that trail until I reread your story, and now I live in his neighborhood.
There's the ties of the trail still today. So here's what we'll do in closing. We did this last year on the 200th anniversary, so we pledged to do it again on the 300th, and we'll come back and give another presentation to the Friends of History. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Robert and Gabriela, for a most informative discussion, and one that really offers insights into not only in terms of the history of the trail itself, but of many of the individuals who are working hard to preserve many of the historic sites that's along the trail that survive today. I did have one question. I was particularly struck by your discussion about the signature rock, and I was wondering if any of the names were familiar to you, or does this represent many of just the original, one-time travelers on the trail?
I'm glad you mentioned Signature Rock. It's also known as Signature Rock, although we called it Autograph Rock. I know Gabby has a story about a repeat name. There's a name inscribed in there, T. Potts, P-O-T-T-S, and there's some debate about whether that may have been a well-known mountain man, beaver trader, Daniel Potts, who was more known north of New Mexico. But did he travel the trail once? It could have been him. So that name sort of grabbed me, and I ended up doing some research on that. But I also remember, Gabby, you coming across some names that were...
There was a name named F.B. Delgado, and he had a really great signature himself. And his name was reoccurring, so we asked about him, and we found that he was a principal owner of a mule and ox train on the trail that made many trips back and forth. And I believe that he was from New Mexico.
And I should point out quickly, thanks, Ben, for the follow-up, that Autograph Trail is not accessible most of the time, but the owners do open it up. You can Google it, I believe in the spring. So there is a period where you can actually go in there, but otherwise it's on private land, so you don't want to trespass in the wintertime. Google it, you'll find it. The Sharps are good people. I'm going to make a guess it's a 5-hour drive from Santa Fe. You could go up there, spend a night in Clayton like we did, you know, on your way home or something. But again, check that out. You can go to Autograph Rock, but it has to be certain days, certain hours. I'm going to make a guess and say Memorial Day to Labor Day. So Google that, look into it. And again, a lot of these sites, Wagon Mound, Rabbit Ears, you can get there in a few hours, have a picnic lunch.
Well, again, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. And helping us to really enrich the experience of the Santa Fe Trail from your time there. And thank you again.
Thank you.
For those interested in reading Robert and Gabriela's reporting on the Santa Fe Trail travels, the links to the Santa Fe, New Mexican articles are provided at the end of this presentation. For our audience, our speaker next month will be Fred Hagstrom, the Ray Shupak Nathan Professor of Art at Carleton College in Minnesota. His topic is Deeply Honored, Two Heroes of the 442nd. This was the World War II segregated U.S. Army unit of volunteers recruited from Japanese American internment camps. This presentation is being presented in conjunction with the Smithsonian traveling exhibit, Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans and World War II. It is currently on display at the New Mexico History Museum through December 31st of this year. In closing, just a reminder that you can rewatch this and other presentations in the Friends of History First Wednesday lecture series on our webpage. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures or more broadly about the Friends of History, we urge you to join our mailing list. If you have not already done so, either via our webpage or by emailing us at the address provided below. And do consider making a donation, however small, via our webpage. We look forward to seeing you in the months ahead. Goodbye for now.